Imagine for a second that you are, the most talented, brilliant leader in your industry. I mean, you are an absolute force of nature.
Right. You're the one everyone relies on.
Exactly. You work 80 hours a week, you hit every single metric, you solve problems before anyone else even sees them coming, and you essentially carry your entire organization, or maybe it's your family or your community project, squarely on your own back.
Which honestly feels incredible at first.
Oh, totally. You feel indispensable. But then, and here's the catch, you retire. Or you move to a new city. Or, let's be real, you just finally burn out.
Yeah, that's the usual wrap.
Right. And within 6 months of your departure, the entire thing you spent your life building completely collapses.
Just falls apart completely.
So the question is, why? Well, according to the source we're looking at today, it's because you committed the ultimate leadership sin. You added, but you didn't multiply.
It is a terrifying scenario, but it's just incredibly common. I mean, we see this in Fortune 500 companies, we see it in local nonprofits, and we certainly see it in historical movements all the time.
Yeah, and I think the assumption is usually that if a leader's departure causes a collapse, well, it just proves how great that leader was, right? Like, look how much they needed me.
Exactly. We feed our egos with that, but if we look closer at the text, it actually proves the exact opposite. It proves their leadership was, well, fundamentally flawed.
And that is exactly the mission for this deep dive today. We are unpacking a pretty comprehensive, I would say paradigm-shifting document titled Mentoring Others, Multiplying Faithful Leaders.
It's a fantastic resource.
It really is. And our goal for you listening, whether you are, managing a corporate team, leading a ministry, directing a nonprofit, or honestly just trying to leave a resilient legacy for your kids, is to discover how to move from merely adding followers to exponentially multiplying leaders.
The core tension presented in this source material is, well, it's really profound. It points out that many highly competent, deeply committed leaders eventually just plateau.
And hit a wall.
Yeah, an invisible wall. And tragically, they actually become the bottleneck of their own impact. They view mentoring, which is the actual giving away of their authority and hard-earned expertise, as, too costly or too slow or just too uncertain.
Right, because it takes time.
So much time. So they end up caring too much, leading too directly, and developing far too few people.
Okay, let's unpack this because it suggests that our entire modern view of leadership is actually completely backward. I mean, we live in a society that rewards output, right?
Oh, 100%.
We reward visibility, busyness, the person who is always the loudest in the room and doing the most work. But the text argues that leadership that does not multiply eventually becomes contained. It traps you.
It does, because the modern metric for success is almost entirely based on accumulation. Like how many people are following you.
Right. Or how much revenue can you produce in a single quarter.
Exactly. And the source material notes that this creates a generation of leaders who are, well, incredibly active, constantly sweating, but are not actually multiplying anything. The shift the text demands is moving from a mindset of addition, which says, I will do more, I will work harder, to a mindset of multiplication, which says, I will raise others who will do more.
Let's really dig into that difference between addition and multiplication, because I think it's very easy to just nod along and say, sure, yeah, multiplication sounds better. But the text makes a really rigorous theological and practical distinction here. Addition is entirely limited by a single person's physical constraints.
Yeah, it is constrained by biology and time. I mean, you only have 24 hours in a day.
Unless you invent a time machine. Yeah.
Right. You only have so much cognitive bandwidth. A leader operating strictly by addition might be brilliant. They might even leave a legacy of visible success. But their impact is ultimately capped by their own presence.
Which is dangerous.
Extremely. The text actually refers to this as the quiet fragility of non-reproducing leadership. If everything depends on your specific genius, then everything is vulnerable to your absence.
Wow. The quiet fragility of non-reproducing leadership, that is a heavy phrase. It feels like the difference between being a solo artisan making these beautiful custom chairs versus building a master guild where hundreds of people learn to make those chairs.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Because as a solo artisan, you can ensure every single chair is perfect. You touch every piece of wood, you control the varnish. But the pushback is, and I know every manager listening to this right now has felt this in their gut, what if I lose quality control?
Yep, the fear of losing control.
Right. If I build the guild, if I multiply and let junior apprentices touch the wood, aren't I risking the integrity of the work? I mean, I might get some wobbly chairs.
And that fear of the wobbly chair is the exact psychological barrier that keeps leaders trapped in addition. It's that preference for uh, immediate visible perfection over messy long-term growth.
Because we hate messy.
We despise it.
Hmm.
To address this, though, the source text pulls from a theological concept, which is that leadership is stewardship, not ownership.
Hmm.
From the earliest pages of Scripture, authority is never presented as a personal possession to be hoarded.
It's borrowed, essentially.
Exactly. We are entrusted with authority for a season. And a steward has to ask a very different question than an owner. An owner asks, how can I make this mine? A steward asks, what will remain when my stewardship inevitably ends?
Which means giving up that absolute control.
It does. The text uses what it calls the seed principle, drawn from the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verse 24. Jesus says that unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit.
So a seed sitting in a beautifully protected glass jar on a shelf stays perfectly intact.
Right. It's safe.
It never gets dirty, it never risks anything, but it also produces absolutely nothing.
That is the paradox of multiplication right there. Holding on leads to limitation. Releasing leads to reproduction. Mentoring operates on this exact same principle. You have to give away your time, your hard-won insight, your access to the higher-ups, and your opportunities.
You literally have to let someone else build the chair.
Yes.
Yeah.
And maybe build it a little worse the first time so they can learn. It requires the surrender of control, which, for a highly competent leader, feels like a kind of death to the ego.
It really does. So why should you care about this? Why does this matter to you as you commute to work right now or prep for your next board meeting? Because measuring your success merely by what you build in your own lifetime, by what you can control with your own two hands, is a recipe for a fragile legacy.
Absolutely. If your influence requires your constant physical presence to survive, you aren't actually leading a movement. You are just managing a shift.
Managing a shift, yeah. That hits hard.
And if the goal is to build that guild, to ensure the work survives you, we really need to look at the historical blueprints of how this has successfully been done.
Right, because nobody wants to reinvent the wheel. And the source text points out that God's design is inherently, fundamentally generational. We see these ancient architectures of leadership everywhere in the text.
We do. God's work rarely depends on isolated lone wolf individuals. There is always a lineage of formation. Like, Moses doesn't just lead the Israelites out of Egypt and call it a day. He actively forms Joshua to take over.
Right.
Elijah doesn't just confront idolatry on Mount Carmel. He forms Elisha to carry the mantle. And notice the pattern in these historical accounts. Joshua didn't merely observe Moses' policies. He had to watch Moses' faith, his failures, his deep dependence on God in the wilderness.
He saw the behind-the-scenes reality.
Exactly. Elisha had to carry a private burden of learning and following long before he ever received public authority. The text actually calls this faithfulness before visibility.
Faithfulness before visibility. And, the text zeroes in on one specific strategic blueprint found in the New Testament that absolutely blew my mind. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2.
Oh, yes. Such a critical verse.
It is a single sentence written by a guy sitting in a Roman prison expecting to be executed. He isn't drafting a 5-year corporate growth strategy with slick PowerPoint slides. He is building a survival mechanism for an entire movement. And the text claims this one verse contains a massive 4-generation vision.
It is arguably the most compressed, brilliant blueprint for organizational multiplication ever written. Paul writes to his young protege, Timothy, and he says, "What you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." In that one sentence, you have 4 distinct generations of transmission.
Okay, let's map those out because the cascading effect here is wild.
Let's do it. So, generation 1 is Paul, the source who received the truth and experienced it firsthand. Generation 2 is Timothy, the entrusted disciple who's currently being formed. Generation 3 is the faithful people, those whom Timothy is being commanded to go find and train. And Generation 4 is others also, those yet to be reached by that 3rd generation. Paul is not telling Timothy to keep the truth in isolation. He is telling him to distribute it intentionally.
Because truth isn't meant to terminate in one life.
Exactly. It is meant to travel.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Think about how we hire or promote in our modern corporate or social structures. We usually fast-track the most visibly talented people, right?
Oh, always.
We look for the charismatic speaker, the brilliant coder, the strategist with the Ivy League degree, the person who commands the room. But Paul tells Timothy to entrust this to faithful people. not the most gifted, not the most eloquent. Why does the text prioritize faithfulness over flash?
What's fascinating here is that multiplication depends entirely on reliability, not just ability. Imagine you are playing a massive game of telephone across decades and continents.
Oh boy.
Right. If the person passing the message is highly charismatic but lacks integrity, what happens? They might draw a massive crowd, sure, but they will eventually distort the truth to serve their own ego. Their lack of faithfulness corrupts what was entrusted to them.
So if Generation 2 hires a flashy narcissist for Generation 3.
Then Generation 4 inherits a toxic wasteland.
Wow.
Precisely. Faithfulness ensures that what begins pure doesn't become diluted or weaponized in transmission. The faithful person shows up consistently, they handle truth with care, they live with integrity when no one is watching, and they persevere through difficulty. They might not shine the brightest immediately, but they endure.
And endurance is the key.
In the economy of this text, endurance is what allows multiplication to survive the centuries.
That is a massive takeaway for you listening. When you are looking for someone to mentor, when you are choosing who gets your most valuable asset, which is your time, stop looking for the brightest star in the room.
Yep.
Stop looking for the person who talks the best game in the staff meeting. Look for consistency. Look for teachability. Look for someone who follows through on the boring tasks. The text actually calls it looking for potential over perfection.
I love that phrase.
You are looking for a pliable heart, a steady river that shapes the landscape over time, rather than a sudden storm that makes a lot of noise, knocks over a few lawn chairs, and just passes quickly.
And this shift from looking for flash to looking for faithfulness perfectly mirrors the ultimate example provided in the text. It brings us to how Jesus selected and trained his own team.
Yes, the text calls his strategy incarnational mentoring, which I know sounds like a heavy theological term,
A bit academic, yeah.
but it basically means extreme proximity. He didn't build an immediate movement through mass appeal. If you hired a modern PR firm for Jesus, they would say, look, you have miraculous healing powers and incredible public speaking skills. Let's do a stadium tour. Let's leverage the crowds.
That would be the modern playbook for sure.
But instead, he concentrated deeply on just 12 guys. 12. The text calls this the scandal of focused investment.
It really does seem scandalous from an efficiency standpoint, doesn't it? Why focus so deeply on 12 messy, flawed individuals when thousands of people are begging for your attention?
It makes no sense on paper.
But Jesus understood a fundamental principle of human sociology. Crowds can gather quickly, but they disperse just as fast. The moment the message gets difficult or the political winds shift, the crowd vanishes.
Right, they're just there for the show.
Exactly. Movements sustained by spectacle alone may impress for a season, but movements sustained by formed people endure forever. Therefore, depth must precede breadth.
His classroom was life itself. It wasn't a sterile lecture hall where everyone sat in rows taking notes. The text describes dusty roads, shared meals, terrifying moments in boats during storms. He prioritized presence before performance.
That is a crucial phrase to remember, presence before performance. Jesus didn't hand them a training manual on day one and say, read chapters 1 through 4 and we'll have a quiz on Friday.
Right, here's your syllabus.
Yeah, no syllab. He invited them into his life. He allowed them to see what the crowds didn't see. They saw his private prayers. They saw his moments of grief. They saw his nuanced responses to hostile opposition. They didn't merely hear his teaching. They encountered the reality of his life.
I love that. Mentoring, based on this text, isn't a classroom where you just dump information onto someone's desk. It is more like an apprenticeship in a high-end kitchen.
Oh, I like where this is going.
I always think of it like this. You can't just read the recipe for a perfect hollandaise sauce.
No, you definitely cannot.
You have to be in the kitchen, you have to smell the smoke, you have to feel the frantic heat of the line, and you have to watch how the head chef handles a dinner rush when the supplier shorted the produce and 3 waiters just called in sick. You learn by absorbing the chaos alongside the master.
That is a phenomenal analogy because it highlights what the text calls the power of proximity. People learn from your habits, your tone of voice under stress, your priorities, and your physical reactions, long before they fully grasp your underlying business strategy or theology.
They absorb the unspoken stuff.
Completely. The disciples didn't just hear Jesus deliver a sermon on prayer. They watched him withdraw into the wilderness to pray in absolute exhaustion. Words instruct, but example interprets.
Words instruct, but example interprets. And without that embodiment, the text says truth just feels abstract. Corporate values printed on a poster in the break room mean absolutely nothing.
Usually just a joke to the employees.
Exactly. But when the CEO actually lives those values, when a multi-million-dollar deal is on the line, well, then the truth becomes tangible. That means, as a mentor, your life is always teaching, whether you realize it or not. The scary question the text asks is, what is your life teaching others to become?
If you as a leader model chronic anxiety, your team inherits fear.
What?
If you model obsessive micromanagement, they reproduce insecurity and risk aversion. But if you model humility, humility spreads. This is the transmission of cultural and spiritual DNA. And it highlights why mentoring cannot be reduced to a 30-minute Zoom call once a month. It involves shared life.
Okay, so proximity and shared life are the foundation. But let's get intensely practical here for a minute. If I just hang out with my junior marketing director for a week, they aren't going to magically absorb my skills through osmosis.
Right. It takes more than just breathing the same air.
I can't just be a good example and hope they catch on. There has to be a mechanism for knowledge transfer. How does a mentor actually move someone from just watching to doing?
Well, the text provides a highly specific 5-step framework for this exact process. It's called the disciple-making cycle, and it's a sequential blueprint for moving someone from a total novice to a multiplying leader.
Okay, 5 steps.
The stages are invitation, demonstration, participation, delegation, and multiplication.
Let's break this down meticulously, maybe using a modern example. Let's say I'm a senior VP, and I've identified a really faithful, high-potential new manager. Stage 1 is invitation. The text uses the phrase, "follow me."
Right. This is that presence before performance we discussed. It is deeply relational. You aren't asking them to produce anything yet. You are inviting them into your space.
So no pressure to perform.
None. You invite them to sit in on a high-stakes client negotiation, and you explicitly tell them you don't need to say a word, just sit in the corner, take notes, and watch. You are creating a safe space where they feel valued just for being there.
Then we move to stage 2 demonstration. Watch me. This is truth modeled.
In demonstration, the mentee is actively observing you navigate real-life challenges, but the key here is the debrief. After that client negotiation, you don't just move on to your next meeting.
You have to unpack it.
Exactly. You sit down with the mentee and say, did you see why I paused for 10 seconds when they asked for a discount? Did you notice how the energy in the room shifted? You are pulling back the curtain on the how and the why behind your actions.
This is where the kitchen analogy comes back. The apprentice watches the chef break down a whole fish. Then we hit stage 3 participation. Do with me.
Here, the mentor creates experiential opportunities. You don't leave them in passive admiration. You call them into the work. They start taking on tasks, but with incredibly close supervision. It bridges the gap between observation and responsibility.
So in the kitchen, this is when the head chef finally hands the knife to the apprentice and says, "You chop the onions for the soup, but I'm standing right here making sure you don't lose a finger."
Perfect example.
Or in our corporate example, the VP says, in the next client meeting, you are going to handle the first 10 minutes. You do the introduction and the initial pitch. I'll be right beside you to handle the hard questions and close the deal.
Exactly. They share the weight. But then comes stage 4, which is where most leaders completely fail delegation. Do it yourself.
Wait, delegation scares me. Honestly, I've tried delegating before and it ended in a massive failure that I had to stay at the office until midnight on a Friday to clean up.
We've all been there.
How does the text differentiate between healthy delegation and just abandoning someone to fail? Because a lot of managers think delegation means, I'm too busy, here, you do this.
Well, that isn't delegation. That is abdication. True delegation, as outlined in the text, is where the tension between trust and control really surfaces. You aren't dumping a task on them. You are entrusting them with responsibility. You step back, but you do not step away.
Step back, not away.
You allow room for them to make decisions, to strategize, and yes, to even make mistakes. If a mentor intervenes the second something looks suboptimal, they prevent true maturation.
So the scrapes and bruises are part of the formation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It requires a deep belief that the mentee can handle the weight, paired with a rigorous feedback loop. They do the entire client pitch themselves, but you are still scheduled to review the outcome and reflect on it together afterward.
Which leads to the ultimate goal, stage 5 multiplication. Teach others. The cycle isn't complete until the mentee begins mentoring someone else. The training wheels are entirely off, and they are now teaching the next new hire how to ride.
And that is the brilliance of this framework. It is a continuous generational loop. When stage 5 is reached, generation 2 has officially begun creating generation 3.
So what does this all mean for the day-to-day logistics? Because it is so easy for this to devolve into just a casual coffee chat. Hey, how's it going? Good, great. See you next month.
Yeah, that's not mentoring.
How do we structure this so it actually results in transformation?
The text is adamant that mentoring without structure risks becoming superficial. It suggests establishing weekly rhythms. This isn't about creating rigid bureaucratic red tape, but creating a predictable pulse for formation.
Okay, what does that pulse look like?
The suggested rhythm includes 4 elements. First, a relational check-in. This goes beyond how's the project, to how's your soul? Where are you experiencing stress?
Getting personal.
Yes. Second, scriptural engagement, or in a secular context, anchoring the discussion in core organizational truths and values. Third, life integration, taking those core truths and applying them to the specific messy decisions the mentee is facing that week.
And the fourth element is assignments. The text places a huge glowing emphasis on assignments.
Yes, because assignments move knowledge from the head to the hands. Mentoring isn't a theoretical classroom exercise. It is a laboratory. An assignment translates the conversation into disciplined action.
Give me an example of that.
So if you've been talking about the value of active listening, the assignment might be, in the staff meeting on Tuesday, I want you to facilitate the brainstorm, and your only job is to draw out the opinions of the 3 quietest people in the room. Then we'll debrief. Without practice, insight just evaporates.
Okay, executing this 5-step cycle and giving out assignments requires a high level of relational capital and authority. I mean, if I'm going to give you homework and hold you to it, you have to genuinely respect me.
You have to earn that right.
Right. But the text argues that this authority doesn't come from having the best title or being a flawless boss. It comes from a surprisingly countercultural place.
This brings us to a hard, unyielding truth presented in the source. Quote, character precedes calling. You cannot impart what you do not possess. The true currency of mentoring is character, accountability, and vulnerability.
Character precedes calling.
A mentor's private disciplines and moral integrity must align with their public influence. If a mentee senses a discrepancy like, if you preach teamwork but stab your peers in the back, it completely destroys your credibility.
You are the living textbook, and part of that textbook is how you handle accountability. The text talks extensively about the tension between grace and truth.
It is the most delicate balance in leadership. Truth without grace crushes the soul. It feels like pure condemnation. If you only ever point out a mentee's flaws, they will eventually shut down out of self-preservation.
Obviously, who wouldn't?
But grace without truth fosters complacency. If a mentee only hears, you're doing great, don't worry about it, they never confront the behavioral patterns that are actively sabotaging their career. Accountability must hold these two in perfect tension. It should be formative, not punitive. It's about restoring someone gently, asking diagnostic questions that focus on their heart and motives, rather than just behavior modification.
But then the text introduces an idea that I found genuinely radical for modern leaders mentoring in seasons of weakness. It cites 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, where Paul talks about a thorn in his flesh and says, power is made perfect in weakness. The core argument here is that mentors don't need to be flawless.
They really don't. In fact, it's better if they aren't.
Let me push back on this heavily, because this feels incredibly risky in the real world. If I'm mentoring a sharp, ambitious junior associate, and I sit down and openly share my failures, my current struggles, my doubts, if I admit that I almost bankrupted my first startup because of my own arrogance, doesn't that undermine my authority? Why would they follow me if I admit I'm actively struggling to figure things out?
It is a completely natural fear. We are taught to armor up in leadership, always project strength. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of human psychology, the text explicitly states that sharing weakness actually amplifies authority.
How does admitting failure amplify authority? That sounds backward.
Because it demonstrates authenticity and a dependence on something greater than human ability. It fosters deep, visceral empathy and cultivates humility in the room. When you model repentance, when you are transparent about your struggles and, crucially, how you are actively seeking growth and guidance through them, you give your mentee a safe space to grow and to fail.
You're showing them the process.
You are showing them how to process weakness. Think about it. If you project an impenetrable facade of perfection, your mentee will hide their own struggles out of shame because they think perfection is the baseline for success. They will bury their mistakes until those mistakes explode.
So if you're waiting until you have everything perfectly figured out, your mental health perfectly balanced, and your career perfectly dialed in before you start investing in someone else, well, You will never start.
Never.
Your authenticity is a far better teaching tool than a brittle facade of perfection. It shows them that transformation is a continual, lifelong process, not a once-for-all achievement you unlock at age 40.
Exactly. When you share how you are navigating a season of intense burnout or a painful failure in your leadership, and you show them how you are relying on grace, discipline, and community to get through it, that is a profoundly more impactful lesson than any polished TED Talk on resilience. You are giving them a roadmap for their own inevitable dark seasons.
So once you have walked with someone through this entire cycle, from that first invitation all the way through delegation, in truth, in grace, and in absolute vulnerability, you reach the final and perhaps the most emotionally difficult phase for any leader:
The release.
overcoming the fear of release, launching them instead of retaining them.
This is the ultimate test. Mentorship is not about creating dependency. Its highest, most noble purpose is release. Yet the text warns that retention, holding on to your best people for too long, is almost always born of a leader's hidden fear.
Fear of what exactly? Losing the talent.
Fear of the mentee making mistakes that reflect poorly on the mentor. Fear of the mentee's perceived inadequacy. Or, very often, the leader's own fear of losing influence or being outshined.
Oh, wow. Being outshined.
Control loves to masquerade as care. A leader might say, oh, they just aren't quite ready yet. I need to oversee this project for another year to protect them. But the text contrasts two biblical figures to illustrate the severe danger of this mindset: King Saul and Barnabas.
Let's look at that contrast, because it plays out in modern offices every single day.
King Saul tried to control and retain David out of deep, paranoid insecurity. Saul saw David's immense potential. He heard the crowds cheering for David, and it terrified him. It threatened his own ego and influence. Instead of launching David, Saul tried to suppress him, which led to stagnation, toxic conflict, and ultimately Saul's ruin.
It's the boss who sabotages the rising star because they are afraid the star will take their job.
Precisely. Now look at Barnabas. Barnabas saw Paul's potential. Keep in mind, the early church was absolutely terrified of Paul because of his history of persecuting them.
Right, they didn't trust him at all.
But Barnabas trusted him. He advocated for him, equipped him, and then crucially released him into ministry. He let Paul surpass him. Release is an act of profound faith. It acknowledges that ultimate growth belongs to God or to the larger mission, not to the mentor's micromanagement.
It's exactly like taking the training wheels off a kid's bike.
Oh, great analogy.
The visceral anxiety you feel watching your kid wobble down the driveway is real. If you hold onto the seat forever because you are terrified they are going to scrape their knee, they never actually learn the physics of balance on their own. The scrapes are an essential part of the formation. If you never let go, they aren't riding a bike. They are just relying on your balance.
That captures it perfectly. You equip them, you set crystal clear expectations, you encourage their initiative, and then you step back. You remain a supportive presence, you don't abandon them, but you step back. And the ultimate metric of success in this entire framework is when the mentee becomes a mentor, when they start holding the bike seat for someone else.
And the text says this shouldn't just be an isolated event. It shouldn't just be one great mentoring relationship that you look back on fondly. It advocates for building a multiplying leadership culture.
Yes, moving from an individual, heroic effort to organizational DNA. Leadership development shouldn't be an accidental exception. It must be the cultural norm. The text suggests creating intentional pipelines, utilizing group mentoring to scale the principles, and establishing reproducible frameworks so that multiplication becomes systemic. When an entire culture expects resources and celebrates the reproduction of leaders, the impact expands exponentially across generations.
You have to actively ask yourself, who is growing because of me? And more importantly, who will continue to build when I am no longer in the room?
Those are the defining questions that separate a manager who adds from a leader who multiplies.
Let's synthesize everything we've unpacked today. We started by looking at the trap of addition. How measuring success by our own immediate output creates a fragile legacy that collapses when we leave. We've explored how to shatter that leadership bottleneck by shifting to multiplication. We traced the ancient blueprints of passing the mantle, looking at Paul's four-generation vision of prioritizing faithfulness over flash. We walked step by step through the incredibly practical disciple-making cycle from watch me to you do it. We embraced the counterintuitive reality that vulnerability and admitting our weaknesses is the ultimate currency of trust. And finally, we learned the vital importance of releasing control, taking the training wheels off to avoid the toxic insecurity of King Saul, and instead create a lasting generational legacy like Barnabas.
It truly is a radical reimagining of what it means to be successful in leadership. It moves the focus entirely off of the self, off of ego, and places it squarely onto the formation and empowerment of others.
We want to leave you with a final thought today, inspired by the deep dive into this text. I want you to pause and think about the person who had the biggest, most undeniable impact on your life. The mentor, the guide, the teacher who completely changed your trajectory. They likely didn't just hand you a manual to read or a set of corporate rules to follow. They gave you their time. They gave you their presence. They gave you their honest, beautifully imperfect self. If true leadership is measured not by how brightly you shine in your own lifetime, but by how faithfully that light burns in others after you're gone. Whose light are you fueling right now, today? Are you hoarding your fire or are you giving it away? Take that thought with you.